Our first lesson today comes from the book of Exodus, chapter 33. It comes after the incident of the golden calf and Moses' advocacy on behalf of the people as God's anger burns against their disobedience. Now Moses wants God's assurance that God will be present and will go with them as they continue their journey through the wilderness and into the promised land. Beginning in verse 12. Moses said to the Lord, "See, you have said to me, 'Bring up this people,' but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, 'I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight.' Now if I have found favor in your sight, show me your ways, so that I may know you and find favor in your sight. Consider, too, that this nation is your people." He said, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." And he said to him, "If your presence will not go, do not carry us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people, unless you go with us? In this way we shall be distinct, I and your people, from every people on the face of the earth." The Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing that you have asked, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name." May God add God's blessing to the reading and the hearing and the understanding of these words. If you would please stand for the gospel reading. Our gospel today comes from the Gospel of Luke chapter 22. It is part of what is often referred to as the Passion narrative and occurs after what will be Jesus' last meal, Last Supper with his disciples. Beginning in verse 39. Jesus came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove the cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." These are the words of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
We are coming to the end of this sermon series called Another Way. As we have looked, probably mostly because of the situation we find ourselves that we've never been in before with this virus, another way of being in relationship with God, another way of being in relationship with one another and with the world. This series has lasted long enough that my red Chuck Taylors for the Pentecost season have turned into my green Chuck Taylors for ordinary time. I have been asked that if we are unable to meet together during Advent, if I will wear purple Chuck Taylors. Of course. And again, I wear them, and I will wear them until we are able to meet in person safely again, because not having you here makes me unhappy, and so I have to balance that out with my Chuck Taylors that make me very happy. It's another way for me to find joy in a difficult time when I'm unable to be with you directly. I'm guessing that you have found some unique ways as well to find joy in the midst of days that aren't always easily filled with the joy, at least the way we nostalgically remember them before March 11th, it seems. We've come on this sermon series and been invited to create space in our lives. A new kind of space, perhaps not unlike Jan Richardson talked about, when God provides space in the cleft of a rock for Moses to be kept safe as God's glory passes him by, as Moses has asked God if he can experience. And cleft comes from the word cleaving. And cleaving can mean both rending or tearing apart as well as bringing together. And in that sort of paradox, we've invited each of us to have a new sense of space. And in that space to make new contact with our natural environment, with the world that God has provided for us. And I asked you both literally and spiritually to kick off your shoes and to allow your feet to touch the ground. And as we have been worshiping outside in person, there was one of our students here who, when I said at outdoor worship, kick off your shoes, and I very unceremoniously kicked off my sandals and didn't hit anyone in the head, he also kicked off his shoes and began running around. And that brought me joy. Because he understood in that moment that I was inviting us to celebrate that we were outdoors and that God's earth is green and verdant for us. And so we create space in our souls and our spirits that way and allow God to help us create that space to be enriched. And then we begin asking soul awakening, self-awakening questions. Asking those questions that perhaps invite us most specifically to go deeper in our lives than maybe we've given ourselves space to go deeper, as deep in a while. And so we were asked to think about when in the last 24 to 48 hours we felt most alive. And if it's been a long time since we felt most alive, maybe we needed to reflect on how it is that God is inviting us to find life in the midst of what all too often seems death and destruction in these particular days. And then we asked what thing in our lives is most meaningful to us, not people, but what thing in our life is most meaningful to us, and what is the story behind that? Why does that have so much meaning? Because very often that has to do with a relationship. And then we allowed the scriptures to ask us, as Frederick Buechner challenged us, what profit a person to gain the whole world if we lose our soul? On what have we set priorities, and are those priorities really what we value? Or do we need to rethink those? And that brought us to the next part, which is thinking theologically and understanding that all of us are theologians, practically speaking. All of us have a version of God that plays in our minds whether we pay attention to it or not. And what I asked you to do in this last week was to keep a little journal, and at the end of the day to ask yourself where it is that you experienced God in that day. And I hope you've done it. And I hope basically what happened was that you noticed the God who is always there. It's just that you attuned yourself more to experiencing that God, and that perhaps there was a renewal. We talked about metanoia. Perhaps there was a change of mind, a repentance not in the form necessarily of dust and ashes, but a repentance of a change of mind or a renewal of our mind. And now as we've gone through those steps and created that space and asked those questions and understood that we have the ability to think about how God is working in our lives on a daily basis, now the question is, what are the next steps? What are the next most important steps? Most especially concerning how it is that we live our lives of faith in the presence of a God who invites us to know we are blessed to be a blessing, to know that God hopes and wants for us life in abundance. A God who continues to reveal God's self through these ancient texts that are made new as we engage them and as they become relevant, as we perhaps take more space and more time to listen to them than we have for a while, because we have more space and more time, not out of choice, but out of a pandemic that takes us up and down like a roller coaster. But as we think about next steps, it sometimes feels overwhelming. You noticed, and Sean and I didn't work on this, you noticed that in Sean's prayer, he gave us space in the midst of that prayer, because there are so many things for which we have to pray in these days that we need space and time to give attention to each one. Because there are fires and floods. Because there is disease and death. Because there is loss of jobs and loss of homes and loss of life. And so when a pastor stands before you and says, now let's talk about next steps, and we look at all of that and we think, how in the world? We remember Jesus challenging us in Matthew a couple of weeks ago, right, to feed the hungry. How can we feed all the hungry and give water to all the thirsty at the same time that we visit all the sick and welcome all the strangers, at the same time we care for and walk with those who are in prison and incarcerated? At the same time that we work for racial justice, at the same time that we work for gender equality, at the same time that we work to be inclusive of brothers and sisters in the LGBTQIA community, it feels all too overwhelming. And what we so often do is we get paralyzed in the impossibility of the nature of how great the need is, and we just stop. And yet what the scriptures do for us is to show us, is to illustrate for us that when things seemed overwhelming was not when God invited God's people to stop, and it's not when the leaders that God had promised to walk with, it's not when those leaders gave up. We saw last week, as Pastor Cheryl said, when God's anger was kindled against these people and it was burning hot in wrath, and God said to Moses, "Let me alone that my wrath may burn hot against these people, your people, Moses, and I may consume them, and of you I will make a great nation." And how it is that Moses didn't cower in that moment. Moses didn't step back. Moses didn't give up and say, "God's anger is too overwhelming for me." No, Moses trusted his relationship with God and said, "God," and asked two self-awakening questions. "Why does your wrath burn hot against your people whom you brought out of slavery in the land of Egypt?" Inviting God in the midst of that blinding anger to remember that these were God's people. And Moses goes on to say, "Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And so the second question is, why will you let your enemies say that you brought out your people to the middle of the desert for evil intentions to kill them? And that's the question Moses asked God to consider. What witness are you making to the world when your covenant with Abraham from the very beginning is that they would be blessed to be a blessing to all the peoples of the earth? How are the people going to be blessed of the earth, Moses says to God, if you kill them? And in an unexpected move, God changes God's mind. It's the 14th verse of the 32nd chapter of Exodus. And then we challenged ourselves, if God is willing to experience metanoia in God's own way, not a repentance, but a change of mind, a renewal of mind, if God's willing to experience that, then who are we to say we can't, or we shouldn't, or we won't? And one would think that experience was intense and overwhelming enough. Now things just need to settle down. And in the first 3 verses of the 33rd chapter of Exodus, God says to Moses, "Now, you have the covenant. We've come to an agreement that I'm not going to consume these people right here and right now, but I need you to take them up from this place and move towards the land flowing with milk and honey. And I'm not going to go with you because they are still stiff-necked and I may consume them. So I'm sending an angel in front of you." That's in the first 3 verses of the 33rd chapter of Exodus. And if I were Moses, I have to tell you, I probably would have thought, that's kind of a relief, right? Because angels aren't kind of as scarily overwhelming as the presence of God. But that's why I'm not Moses. Because Moses realizes that the easy way is not always the way of God. So Moses doesn't accept it. He says to God, "If I have found favor in your sight, as you have said that I have, and if this is what you want me to do, to lead this people toward the land flowing with milk and honey, I won't go another step without you. Unless you are in our midst, I will not go up from here." God says in the translation, it's not a direct translation, but it sort of says that at that point God says, "Okay, I'll go maybe beside you, maybe even in front of you, or maybe even behind you. But I can't go with you because my power and your stiff-neckedness, your brokenness, your sinfulness might again engender my anger to the point of consuming you." And Moses says, "No, God. No, this is the moment. We can't do this without you. and I won't do this without you. This is a turning point, friends, in our faith history. And God says, Moses, I do know you. And you have found favor in my sight. And I will do what it is you have asked. Friends, the scriptures are about revealing the character and nature of God and how God is in relationship with God's people. Now, I want you to remember that at the beginning, when God calls Moses to free God's people in Egypt, Moses says, who am I to tell them that is sending me up, and who is going with me? And God says, tell them, I am who I am has sent you. Also translated as I will be who I will be. Now God is enriching that revelation at Moses' question, because God says, I will do what you asked. And Moses says, Lord, let me catch a glimpse of your glory. And God says, okay, I will pass you by. I will put you in the cleft of the rock while my glory passes by. And I will reveal to you that I am the Lord, and I will be merciful on whom I am merciful, and I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious. God reveals more of God's self because of Moses' trust in the relationship that Moses has with God. And what God chooses in that moment is not consuming anger and destruction for God's people. God chooses graciousness and mercy as a foundational part of God's revelation and God's name. God not only is I am who I am and I will be who I will be, God is now I will be merciful to whom I am merciful, and I will be gracious to whom I am gracious. That's who God is going up with Moses. Now, go with me to that gospel lesson. Go with me to that passion narrative. Go with us to Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, a moment that happens in all four of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In their own ways, they all have this moment. And in the moment when Jesus says, Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. I don't want to be crucified for these people. They have worked against me. They have called me Beelzebul. They've questioned your authority through me. Even my own disciples are not in agreement about all these Gentiles and the Samaritans and the people that have never been invited before that I'm inviting. And then Jesus says, not my will, but your will be done. Is it possible that part of Jesus' revelation of self and of God is based on that seminal moment with Moses and God after the golden calf, after God has changed God's mind about bringing destruction on the people, when Moses says, I'm not going without you, and God says, you know what? I'll do what you said because I will be led by grace and mercy, not by wrath, anger, and consumption and destruction. And on that, Jesus continues then to reveal that mercy and that graciousness when Jesus says, not my will, but your will be done. And that will of God is mercy and grace, not Jesus going out and raising up an army to violently overthrow the Roman Empire that's working against him. Instead, Jesus will say from the cross, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And I don't know if we had reached that moment if it hadn't been for Moses and God in those moments, not only in the midst of the golden calf, but also in the moments of God changing God's mind, and in those following moments when God says, I will be led by mercy and grace with these people. I will go with you. It's that God that we follow. It's that God that invites us to bring about God's vision on earth, even as God is in heaven. And we know what that vision is because Jesus reveals it to us. That the hungry and the food insecure are fed, and the thirsty are given to drink, and the naked are given clothing, and the sick and the in prison are given comfort, and the strangers are welcomed among us. And And when we are overwhelmed, let me remind you that after God passes in God's glory over the cleft of the rock where Moses is, they don't just immediately the next day enter into a land flowing with milk and honey. They continue a 40-year journey toward that land. And then when they are on the threshold of it, God takes Moses up to the top of Mount Nebo and says, Moses, you can see it, but you're not the one who's going to lead my people over. It's Joshua who does that. And Moses is swept up into God's glory. It doesn't happen all at once. The quote from Lao Tzu, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. Jesus doesn't come out of the Garden of Gethsemane and then suddenly appear in the upper room, resurrected, showing the disciples his hands and his feet, and illustrating the eternal kingdom of forgiving grace. Instead, Jesus leaves that garden. In fact, he doesn't even leave that garden before the betrayal happens, and he's arrested, and he's taken to a kangaroo court, and he confronts Pilate, and he's whipped, and he's scorned, and he's given a crown of thorns. Friends, we don't reach the vision all at once. We take one step, the next best step. Our world is reeling right now. What's the one next best step you can take? We can't comfort over 200,000 families who have lost loved ones to a virus. These are people, not numbers, real, live people who are now gone from their families on this earth. The answer when we're overwhelmed by that number is not just simply to say that's a number and until it happens to my family, I don't care. The answer is, how do you comfort your next door neighbor because they've lost their job? How do you comfort the family down the street because they can't get their children connected to social media in order to go to school? How do you comfort each other because the smile at the front desk that was named Karen Browse has gone into God's full presence, and we've lost a team member? Comfort the person who's next to you. Comfort the person who is your neighbor. Comfort the person down the street. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. How do we make again the racial unrest that is back on fire because of the grand jury and Breonna Taylor in what doesn't seem justice for all too many in that part of our country? And we can wring our hands and we can get angry and we can say once again, this is not effective. The anger and the looting and the rioting is not going to help anything. And we feel afraid, so we get angry, or we feel afraid and we become paralyzed. And my question is, what can we do? What can we do in our own community? Is there a person of color to whom you can give encouragement? That you can ask how they're doing? That you can invite them to tell the stories of how many times they've been arrested when they've been driving without having done anything wrong? Is that okay with you? That might be a self-awakening question. Would I be willing? From my place and station in life? Not to just sit back at an objective distance and rage against those who are enraged, but can I offer a peaceful presence to someone in this county, in this state? We are in a political arena that is overwhelming in its negativity. And in the middle of that, friends, I want Grace to be a place, literally a place where people from every political perspective can come together. And I've witnessed it here. Not all the time, but I've witnessed it here. And I've been here long enough that you all know where I am on political issues and on social issues. And while I don't preach that in stark ways, I know you know. And you know I know because I've been here long enough to know you. And do you know that I have been out to dinner on multiple occasions with people, and we both know, the family who's sitting across from me, and I know we don't agree on so many things. And do you know we enjoy bang bang shrimp at Bonefish Grill? And we smile at each other when we get a little bit in crosshairs about our perspectives. And we're compassionately honest. Because what we do agree about is the way we want to treat one another. And the mission and ministry of this church that we love. I shared on Facebook a post that I saw this week about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Antonin Scalia's friendship. And it's a rather long article, and it talks about how they had a shared love of opera and how they got close enough that their families had holiday celebrations together. And that toward the end of his life, he had a couple of dozen roses on his desk, and he says to this colleague of his, I want you to take those down to Ruth's office. And the colleague said, why? I mean, I haven't even given my wife 24 roses for any reason in my whole lifetime. And you're going to give one who's been adversarial to nearly every decision that you've had on the court throughout the course of your career? And he pushed Judge Scalia a little bit further because he was coming to the end of his life as well. And he said that what Judge Scalia said to him was, there are more important things than disagreements about the law. There are more important things for people of faith than disagreements about social issues and disagreements about political issues. And what's more important is God calling us all beloved children. And God inviting us to, yes, serve those who are in greatest need together. And believing somehow that we will come to trust God in a deep enough manner that we will have a kind of relationship that will allow us to be in dialogue with our faith, even when it makes us uncomfortable, and to maybe experience metanoia where we need a renewal of our mind. So I'm going to promise you this, whether you're tired of it or not, I will intermittently ask soul awakening questions of you and of me and ask you to engage them. I will intermittently ask if you're keeping that journal of where you experience God in the course of your day. And I will continuously ask you, as well as the other pastors and the staff on all our campuses, what is our next best step forward at a place called Grace that witnesses God's embrace of all people? Amen.